Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everybody. I'd like for you to take a moment to think about your identities. Are you the same person you were a few years ago, or the same person you were as a child? What are the events of your life that have shaped who you have become over the years? Are you the same person you were before the pandemic? In what ways have you transitioned over the years? Also, has a court of law ever made a decision on whether or not the law protects you on the basis of any of your identities? Take a moment to think about that as well. So each June is the month that highlights LGBTQ pride, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. LGBTQ pride is about celebrating and recognizing identities as well as transitions. So let me tell you a bit about my identities. I was adopted at the age of 6 months from Taiwan. I was baptized at Chevy Chase Presbyterian Church up the road. And as Tim said, my parents and I came to Westmoreland around 1996. That's when Gordon Forbes, Melinda Reed, and Audrey Chapman were active here. I'm also a binge eater and compulsive overeater. This past spring, I joined Overeaters Anonymous, and Zoom meetings has made getting frequent support easier. I was also diagnosed with severe obstructive sleep apnea last summer after ignoring the science for about 10 years. An anesthesiologist said, "You should consider talking to your doctor about this." And ironically, as I said, "Sure, I'll sleep on it." Some of you knew that was coming. So in middle school, I was diagnosed with what used to officially be Asperger's syndrome, which today might be referred to as autism spectrum with minimal level of supports. So I also work full-time in the autism field. I work in the healthcare industry in Prince George's County as a service coordinator for services funded by Medicaid that support autistic children at home who have substantial support needs. Now, with being on the autism spectrum, pride events can be overwhelmingly loud with noise. Since there was no official pride parade and the UCC wasn't officially doing anything, I wasn't able to join them in the parade where there's intermittent crowds. So that's how if I can participate in a way where I can sort of, have that's what I look for. Now, Pride in Veterans Plaza a couple of weeks ago in Silver Spring was so loud that my roommate and I could only stay for 15 minutes. I messaged the organizers over Facebook to let them know that the event wasn't accessible to neurodiverse folks with sound sensitivity. And to me, there is such a thing as too much bass, regardless of what Meghan Trainor may sing about. One organizer said they will look at that aspect of accessibility next time. Now, often with transition comes recognizing new identities. I was adopted from another country, and my citizenship here was naturalized through adoption. Also, my name was changed upon adoption as well. So technically, I've had a couple of name changes throughout my life. I was assigned male at birth, but early on, I knew that was not my gender identity. Often, we transgendered people have at least a feeling of the gender which we are not at an early age, and that dysphoria and stress grows the longer we don't live in a manner consistent with our identity and expression. And in some extreme cases, or in a lot of cases, that stress can lead to mental health problems or compound already existing mental health problems, can lead to self-injurious behavior like cutting, and even suicide, and that's the unfortunate reality. So not supporting a transgender child or anyone who's transgender goes against the advice of the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Counseling Association, and the National Association of Social Workers. The reason why there's this boom of coming out is because people are becoming more comfortable to come out. And also, there's words. When I was 12, I didn't know the word transgender or gender non-conforming. And the reality is, if you look deep in history, we've been present for a long time. It's just that a lot of history textbooks don't tell you that. So I came out transgender in the fall of 2015. If some of you follow me on Facebook, you've seen me post about that. So, and I came out in 2015 and began living as myself full-time once I started my current job in November 2015. In 2018, I came out again, but as pansexual, meaning my attraction to others isn't really influenced by their gender identity or sexual orientation. So sometimes, even with a shift in open gender identity, can come a shift in sexual orientation, and that's quite common in the trans community. Also, while I was baptized in a Presbyterian church, I now identify with the UCC. But if I attended both churches, would I be considered bisexual? While my racial background is East Asian, I do not speak Chinese. So far in my life, the only time I've been in a room where East Asians make the majority is when I'm with my paternal side of the family. So yes, do I have some familiarity with the Chinese culture? Yes, from my paternal side of the family. But being of the Asian race is only a part of who I am. For my postgraduate year of high school, I went to a boarding school in Pennsylvania, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and to college in West Virginia, Marshall University, go herd. I was stereotyped a lot based on my Asian complexion alone. So when I started speaking and went off campus, some people said, "Your English is so good," and I had this reaction. But that is the result of us being viewed as perpetual foreigners. Race can sometimes be different from a person's culture. So, again, as I said, it's not necessarily my culture identity, but it is racially because, well, it's what you see. And this is something I definitely want to emphasize during this pandemic. And it's also one reason why I changed my last name to be stereotyped less, and well, to get a fresh start for other reasons as well. So if you've been paying attention to transgender matters in the news, you might know about the public bathroom bills that have been introduced to legislators that would traumatize transgender people into using the public bathrooms that match their sex assigned at birth instead of their gender identity. Here's a simple solution. If you have issues utilizing public bathrooms with trans people, stick to the bathroom at your house or wear a diaper. Gavin Grimm, a transgender man from Gloucester County, Virginia, he sued his school board for not allowing him to use the boys' facilities. His school board decided that transgender students must be traumatized in using the bathroom that corresponds to their sex assigned at birth, and the school board appealed this case all the way to the Supreme Court. Thankfully, on Monday, June 28th, it was reported that SCOTUS declined to hear the school board's appeal. The school board attorney argued in the court system, quote, "The question how best to respond to a teenager who identifies with the opposite biological sex is often excruciatingly difficult," end quote. First off, there are many gender identities, not an opposite gender. And the reason it is difficult is because there are people who choose to make it difficult and often will inculcate or maybe indoctrinate children with rigid expectations of sexuality and identity. Gender-neutral bathrooms are wonderful. We use them a lot. Porta potties, the bathrooms on airplanes, buses, and trains, and they're just marked bathroom or just lavatory. And like the ones at Starbucks or Subway. The bathrooms at Starbucks were where it was the place where I would change when I was presenting as myself part-time before transitioning to living as myself full-time. And this was especially when I was still living at home with my dad, and when I finished work, my distress would be just so high that I just needed to change. But also these gender-neutral bathrooms help out people with disabilities. And as we all age, some of us sooner than me will probably need help with the bathroom depending on level of disability. So there are also efforts at legislation that would also traumatize transgender girls into playing on the boys' sports teams in school and subject student athletes to genital inspections to prove gender. I'm reminded of an episode of The West Wing. A Chinese Christian refugee is stowaway on a ship with others seeking asylum because of religious persecution in China. He talks to President Bartlett and is asked how he worships and to name the 12 apostles to assess the legitimacy of his claim for asylum. He starts to list the apostles, but then says, quote, "Christianity is not demonstrated by a recitation of facts. You're seeking evidence of faith, a wholehearted acceptance of God's promise of a better world. For we hold that man is justified by faith alone. That is what St. Paul said, justified by faith alone," end quote. In October 2019, the Maryland Motor Vehicle Administration added an X as a third option for the gender marker on our identifications for those who may not identify within the gender binary. In Maryland, to update your gender marker on all you need to do is self-attest at the MVA. The State Department has also recently begun adding an X on passports as well. Gender identity is not determined by whether or not you produce sperm or if you menstruate or can get pregnant, if you have a penis or a vagina or a uterus. These exams only show how the person might produce or reproduce. So gender identity is justified by self-attestation of consistent gender identity. I'm not so sure why we have gender markers on driver's licenses, because last I checked, you don't need your genitals to drive a car. So this pandemic, we've seen a lot of targeted hate crimes towards people of Asian racial background due to COVID-19 stigma. The Chinese have been in America for quite a while, despite a dark history. As a child, I remember hearing my grandpa, who died in his 90s in 2004, the same year my mom died. He told me that his father, or maybe his grandfather, worked on the Transcontinental Railroad here in America. He also said we had a Cuban ancestor. But we learned a little bit more last year, and it turned out it was an ancestor of Chinese descent who lived or grew up in Cuba. So, and I emailed my family saying, hey, there's different ways of being Cuban, different ways of being Chinese culture. It is important we do not assume a person's culture or reason, place of origin based on their racial complexion alone. It's ironic that some people eat Chinese food but not welcome Chinese people themselves. At the beginning of the pandemic, before lockdown, I gave some business to Chinese takeout places and got my nails done at nail salons run by Asian people as a way to show my solidarity. I think I'm not welcomed at one takeout place since I told them I put my ketchup on my order of sesame chicken. But in all seriousness, some of you know I like ketchup and that led to heartburn issues, but in all seriousness, if it's been a while since you've ordered Chinese food, please consider doing so soon. Just don't tell them what you put on it. If many of us can accept and respect identities that are different from birth, and identities that might not always match up the way you think, like families, citizenship, religious denomination, culture, if you can wrap your mind around that I'm an Asian woman who doesn't speak Chinese, then we should be able to understand transgender people and people who are not heterosexual. I have several identities, as I hope you can see, that were assigned to me at birth that have changed as I have grown. Some of you have changed over time and have adopted different identities. Some of you have gotten married and changed your last name and your honorifics, like Miss Jones to Mrs. Smith. And this is similar to how many transgender people change their names and pronouns, the same amount of 2 changes. So we change throughout life, identities have shifted. We have changed. Think about the shift in God's gender. In June, the UCC Facebook page posted that God's pronouns are they and them. These gender-neutral pronouns aren't that hard if you think about it. Someone I know in the local trans community pointed out that staff in the Trump administration used they and them pronouns to refer to the anonymous whistleblower. Some people may not identify with a gender, like some may not identify with a religion, or people who move around for work may not identify with being from a particular place. The unfortunate pandemic has revealed the bad parts of society, systemic flaws such as lack of accessibility for people with disabilities, and my line of work, that has been emphasized a lot as well. We've also seen individual and systemic racism and xenophobia. The pandemic has also shown how much some people are obsessed with freedom to the point at the expense of other people's health and safety. I hope we can use this time to think about who we want to be as we reach a more predictable way of life. I think we can add a verse to Ecclesiastes 3, a time to transition. A time for us to transition from the old to the new, with some of the old incorporated. We must think about what changes can become permanent. For people with mobility disabilities, public transit can be a complex obstacle course. And in Prince George's County, where I work, public transit is almost non-existent. Remote work has made accessibility easier. Uber Eats has a delivery option that asks the delivery person to have the food just left at the door. And for an introvert like me, I like that. I'm about to wrap up, but I would like to leave you with some ally tips before I do. Be mindful of the language and words we use. Until you know someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, use gender-neutral words when greeting and conversing with them. If someone comes out to you, it very likely means they trust you to keep that in confidence. I'm not exaggerating when I say coming out LGBT has cost many their families, jobs, their livelihood, and sometimes their lives. If you hear someone making anti-LGBT statements, tell them it's hurtful. Stop patronizing businesses that donate money to anti-LGBT organizations. And for parents, I do support the decision to carefully decide any permanent measures like hormones or surgery. And hormones, they can be a roller coaster. But not letting someone live consistently with their gender identity will do more harm than good. In closing, I think it's important that as we move closer to predictability, we think about transition. Who we were, who we will become. What was our identity? What will our new identity be? And what will this transition look like? So the reflective piece that me and Alec are going to play is from the German musical named Elisabeth with an S. And I haven't seen the full musical, but I first saw it performed by Marussia and the Andre Rieu Orchestra. And the basic premise of the musical is that Empress Elisabeth was, even though she was an empress, she was pretty, I think, oppressed. She wasn't given much opportunity to be herself. She wanted independence to be who she was. So I'm not gonna sing, and I'm not a good singer solo, but the lyrics basically talk about being your own person, don't hold me down too much, and let me fly, let me have some independence. Thank you. These are tough ones.